There are probably some aspects you don't like about your job. But is your work entirely pointless, devoid of any meaning for society? Then you might have a bullshit job. This phenomenon was first addressed by David Graeber, and today we will have a look at his book of the same name, Bullshit Jobs. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and I welcome you to the book review of Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. Graeber was an American anthropologist. Unfortunately, he died last year, 2021. He had taught at the Yale University, the University of London, and at the London School of Economics. He was a political activist, holding anarchist positions, and he had a leading role in the Occupy Wall Street movement. He published a number of books and articles. Among those was an article for the Strike magazine in 2013 that was titled "On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs, a Work Rant." And this article made quite some waves, was well received, and there was a lot of attention. A lot of people wrote to Graeber saying, yeah, this is exactly my job, and he collected a lot of those accounts. Later he even asked for them and collected more, and there were also two polls, two surveys, one in the United Kingdom and one in the Netherlands after that article. So a lot of additional material was created. And Graeber used that to further elaborate on the topic in this book, Bullshit Jobs. By the way, the book contains the initial article in the preface. The book was published in 2018 and it is structured the following way. First, Graeber discusses what a bullshit job actually is and what different types of bullshit jobs there are. Then he describes the impact a bullshit job has on the person doing it. After that, he tries to figure out how bullshit jobs came to be in the first place, the reasons for the rise of bullshit jobs. And finally, he describes the political effects of bullshit jobs and a possible solution. We will have a look at that. First of all, what is a bullshit job? Here Graeber gives an example, an account of a guy called Kurt, and Kurt works for a subcontractor of the German military, the Bundeswehr. Yeah, that was quite funny for me. Now the situation is as follows. In some barracks, some soldier has to move to a different room, and he has a computer. Now, he couldn't just unplug his computer and carry it over. This would be totally unthinkable. What he has to do is to ask the IT department to do it. Now, the IT department isn't the actual IT department of the German military, but it is a subcontractor. Now, this company says, oh, well, moving computers around, this is below us, but we have another subcontractor for logistics. And for some reason that one has another subcontractor for personnel, and this is where Kurt works. Now, in the end, Kurt will drive 500 kilometers to those barracks and he will unplug this computer and put it in a box. Then a guy from the logistics company will carry the box over to the other room, and Kurt will then unpack it again and plug it in. Now this may sound simple, but of course there are dozens of forms that need filling out. In the end, a couple €100 are spent on a task the soldier himself could have finished in about 10 minutes. Now here it is quite obvious that this job doesn't have any purpose whatsoever. Instead of creating any value, it actively destroys it. So it is pretty obvious that this is a bullshit job. However, it isn't always that clear, so during the first chapter, Graeber tries to formulate a working definition of what exactly a bullshit job is. And his final definition is: a bullshit job is a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. A rule of thumb Graeber likes to use is to ask, what if all people in whatever job were to disappear overnight? Imagine tomorrow all the garbage collectors would be gone. Cities would become uninhabitable in a few days. Imagine, on the other hand, all telemarketers were to disappear, the people who try to sell you stuff on the phone. Now, I'd say the world would be a tiny bit better. An important distinction is that bullshit jobs are not merely bad jobs or shit jobs. They are more like the opposite. A shit job is described by Graeber as a job where you have to work really hard. You get lousy payment. You don't have a lot of social prestige. Working conditions are bad, but what you do has actual social value. What you do is useful. A bullshit job is pretty much the opposite of that. In a bullshit job, what you do has absolutely no social value, is absolutely useless, but you are often paid well, have comfortable working conditions, and maybe even some social prestige. It is important to clarify also that bullshit jobs are not unique to the public sector. Now, we all know those cliches of public servants who do nothing but push around forms all day. However, Graeber says that bullshit jobs are just as common in the private economy, where we would expect everything to be highly efficient and highly optimized. In the first chapter, Graeber also mentions the phenomenon of the bullshitization of normal jobs, which means that the time we spend for our actual tasks, for what we are actually paid to do, that decreases while we spend more and more time on things like emails, meetings, paperwork, formalities, and the like. In the second chapter, Graeber describes 5 distinct types of bullshit jobs that he identified in all those accounts he got. First of all, we've got flunkies. Flunkies are there to make someone else feel important. For example, if I say, oh, I have such an important position here, I need at least 10 people working under me, and well, I will figure out sometime later what they are supposed to do all day, then those are flunkies. Or another example would be a company that employs a receptionist even though they don't need one, because they feel it's important for their image to have someone sitting there all day with nothing to do. The second type of bullshit jobs are goons. Goons are necessary only because others have them as well. The most obvious example would be soldiers. You wouldn't need soldiers if other countries wouldn't have any either. But it also applies to lobbyists, PR specialists, telemarketers, corporate lawyers, and plenty others. Then we have duct tapers. Duct tapers have to treat the symptoms of problems that shouldn't be there in the first place. One example is an underling who has to spend all day fixing the problems caused by his boss. Another example are IT people who spend all day fixing compatibility issues that arise because the company uses open source components instead of developing what they need themselves. Next, we have box tickers. Box tickers pretend the organization is doing something it is actually not doing, such as doing as they should according to government regulations and the like, complying with government regulations. Here Graeber has the example of a woman working in a home for the elderly, where she has to conduct surveys, where she asks the old people about their preferences for leisure time activities, and the old people never get any of that, but the surveys have to be conducted all the time and properly archived and whatnot without any effect. Finally, we have taskmasters. The better kind of taskmasters merely supervise people who don't actually need supervision. The worst type of taskmasters actually generate bullshit tasks or even entire bullshit jobs, or they oversee bullshit tasks. So, for example, a superior who creates unnecessary work, keeping everybody from doing their actual work, that would be a taskmaster of the second kind. Now, of course, there is plenty of overlap and there are a lot of jobs that fall into multiple categories, but those 5 are the most distinct. In chapter 3 and 4, Graeber discusses the effects doing a bullshit job, having a bullshit job, has on the person doing it. There is a fluent transition from chapter 3 to 4, so I deal with both in one go. At the beginning, Graeber gives the example of a guy called Eric who was working in a company that was organized as a partnership, with each office being run by one partner. And Eric's job was to take care of some system that was used company-wide, some kind of intranet application, I think. And the twist, the important point was that one of the partners wanted that system and all the other partners didn't want it and actively sabotaged it. So they employed Eric to do maintenance and whatever for this system, but he wasn't actually expected to do anything because nobody wanted the system. So in the end, Eric didn't have anything to do all day, but he still was getting paid handsomely. Now, the interesting thing is, most of us would probably intuitively say, well, this isn't such a bad situation. Getting good money for doing nothing, I probably would like that. However, Eric was quite unhappy about this situation. Eric was suffering a lot from this job and ultimately he quit this position. And this is something Graeber observed frequently. He says he got a handful of accounts from people who were quite happy about their bullshit jobs, who said, oh, this is so awesome, I get paid good money, I don't have anything to do, I love this. But most of the accounts he got were from people who were suffering from their bullshit jobs and who were quite unhappy about it. And one aspect they described as problematic was the lack of sense, the lack of purpose, the lack of doing anything useful. And another aspect that was often mentioned was the falsehood, the make-believe. And this frequently led to stress and sometimes even to health problems. So Graeber here coined the term spiritual violence. In regard to the problem of lack of purpose, he describes the findings of the German psychologist Karl Gross, who noticed that when children for the first time notice they can manipulate their environment and they have an impact on their environment, they are overjoyed. And later it was discovered that if you afterwards withhold the means to have an impact on the environment from those children, the effects on the psyche will be catastrophic. And this is pretty much what happens in a bullshit job. The means to have any effect, to have any to make any difference for society is pretty much withheld from the people doing them. In regard to the falsehood, Graeber believes that our practice to sell time for money is a big issue, because this obviously involves and leads to the idea that it is morally wrong not to actively work during time someone is paying for, even if there is nothing useful to do, even if this means you have to make up work, pretend to work, or prolong work. So this is even in a normal job, this is something that is rather unpleasant, and bullshit jobs pretty much entirely consist of this make-believe and pretending to work. And another point is, if you are, let's say, a bartender who has to polish the clean bar for the third time because the boss says you have to do it, then there is a clear bully. However, in bullshit jobs, the situation is often quite vague and unclear, and the rules are unknown. A lot of the accounts Graeber got include statements like, I wonder if my superior knows that I am just watching cat videos all day. Is he aware I'm not doing any work and he pretends not to notice? Or is he really oblivious to the reality of the situation? And what about my colleagues? Do they know? And this uncertainty, this vagueness, this not knowing the rules is, according to Graeber, an important part of this suffering the falsehood and make-believe causes. And it is the situation is especially bad for people whose bullshit jobs cause actual harm. Here Graeber describes the account of one Mina who was working in a shelter for the homeless, and her job basically was to kick the homeless out of the homeless shelter if they were unable to provide the necessary paperwork within 3 days. Things like ID and social security number, whatever. And obviously, people who had been living on the street for years, drug addicts, women fleeing from domestic violence, teenagers abandoned by their parents and the like, they usually had problems providing that paperwork. So you can imagine how happy Mina was about this job. In the 5th chapter, Graeber tries to figure out why bullshit jobs are proliferating, and in this chapter he is looking at the social and economic level, at the social and economic forces that led to the proliferation of bullshit jobs. Now, greatly simplified and shortened, his description goes like this. In the past decades, we had an economic development where agriculture was in a steep decline, industry stagnated or declined as well, but we had a steep increase in the service industry. And this increase wasn't caused by there being more waiters and hairdressers and cashiers and the like. Those stayed at about the same level, but it was caused by new positions in administrative jobs, management, consultants, IT people and the like. And this is where Graeber expects most of the bullshit jobs to be. He especially has his eyes on the so-called FIRE sector. FIRE stands for finance, insurance and real estate. And this FIRE sector over the years has gotten quite entangled with the classic productive sector. However, in the FIRE sector itself, nothing is produced, but the FIRE sector merely skims off wealth. For example, in the form of interest on debts or in the form of rents. So the FIRE sector is not about production like classic capitalism, but it is about the distribution of loot like medieval feudalism, where the king said, yeah, half of your harvest goes to me, thank you very much. And Graeber says, in this situation, what developed was a kind of modern feudalism, a kind of managerial feudalism. And in such a system, of course, bullshit jobs make sense, such as the flunkies. In medieval times, there were plenty of flunkies and also the other types. In the 6th chapter, Graeber also looks at the political and social level. He tries to figure out why society doesn't see bullshit jobs as a problem and why we don't do anything about them. And here, the most essential topic is our attitude towards work. Now, first of all, what people in bullshit jobs lack and what they want is to generate some social value, to make a meaningful contribution to society. And Graeber says this is a problematic aspect nowadays because social value and actual monetary value are kind of inversely related nowadays. People who perform a job that really has clear and tangible social value usually are not paid very well, they have bad working conditions, low social prestige, and so on. And weirdly, we not only accept the situation, but we kind of feel that this is how it should be. For example, after the big economic crisis of 2008, plenty of banks were bailed out everywhere without any conditions. But later, when other industries were rescued, there were drastic cuts. For example, in the United Kingdom, as part of the austerity program, there were pay cuts for public servants such as nurses, bus drivers, firefighters and the like. And in America, when the automotive industry was bailed out, there were drastic cuts for assembly line workers in the automotive industry. And this was widely accepted. So the idea, if sacrifices need to be made, it should be done by those people who have to make sacrifices anyway, seems to be quite common. Or the idea that if you do any work that has real purpose, then this should be sufficient gratification in itself and you don't need lots of money on top of that. So work is considered a value in itself, and this wasn't always the case. For example, in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, work was for women and for slaves, and a proper respected citizen would never do any work. Being a respected citizen meant not working. And Graeber traces the historical development that led to the attitude we have today. In religion, the view was somewhat ambivalent from the beginning. On one hand, when humans were expelled from the Garden of Eden, work came upon us as punishment. But on the other hand, work also from the beginning had a positive aspect because work meant we could, on a small scale, produce and create something ourselves, which was a kind of divine ability. And this positive aspect was extended over time. The Puritans, or the English Calvinists to be precise, and later the Methodists, and then the Protestants, they preached that work was something noble, something that is valuable and an end in itself. However, this aspect of punishment also remained. So the idea that work was something you don't actually want to do, that prevailed, and work became something like a noble sacrifice. And over time, also the idea appeared that the most noble work was reward enough in itself, and you really wouldn't need money on top of that. A very interesting idea that we have throughout history is the idea that work is a means of personal development and advancement. We had this, for example, in the Middle Ages in Northern Europe, where it was perfectly common that you spend the first 7 to 15 years of your working life as a servant in another's household. This was true for men and for women, for the lowest farmer to the highest aristocratic elite. We know this, this still applies to some degree nowadays for craftsmen. You join a master craftsman as an apprentice. Over time you become a journeyman, and at some point you become a master craftsman yourself. And then you leave the household of your master and you start your own, you establish your own household, you marry, and you take on apprentices of your own. So in medieval times, work was, paid labor was a means to become a proper, full, independent adult who no longer had to do paid labor for others. And similar ideas existed in America after the Independence War. There, this idea that you started doing paid labor, but then you were able to ascend in the social hierarchy and become someone independent who had other people working for him, that was well established. And it was also later romanticized as the American dream, the idea of the self-made man, from rags to riches, and so on. In regard to the view society had on work, the importance of work to society, there also was an interesting situation in America in the early days before the Civil War, because they had there the labor theory of value was well established and kind of common sense. The labor theory of value states that labor is the source of all value. For example, if I pay a baker for a piece of bread, then what I'm actually paying for is the labor that went into creating that bread. Labor is the source of capital. Labor is the source of value, and labor is the source of social prosperity. Now, for us nowadays, this would clearly be leftist ideology, because it means that we owe social prosperity to the common laborer, to the common employee, and not to the elite who owns the companies and the factories and so on. However, in pre-Civil War America, as I said, this was pretty much common sense. Graeber, for example, quotes a speech by Abraham Lincoln where he had included those ideas. And in this time, work was also regarded as something that creates moral superiority over the idle rich. However, this changed after the Civil War. There, this ideology was replaced by an ideology of capital, where capital was seen as the source of value and of prosperity. So you might notice that some tangible values of work have fallen away over time. we usually no longer have this advancement to full independent adulthood. We also are no longer the creators of value and social wealth and social prosperity. At the same time, we are expected to adjust our lives to our work more and more. So, those religious ideas of work being a noble sacrifice and a value and a means in itself, this has to come in again to fill the gap. And according to Graeber, this creates what he calls the paradox of modern work. On one hand, most people derive their dignity and self-worth from their work to a large degree. On the other hand, most people hate their jobs. And this seems to be like a contradiction at first, but it makes sense if we consider work to be a noble sacrifice, if work is valuable because we don't want to do it, because we don't enjoy it, because it is a sacrifice. That's why we nowadays like to boast with how hard we work, how much we work, and even those that don't do that still believe that those who avoid work, who don't work, that those are to be detested. Finally, in the 7th and last chapter, Graeber discusses political effects of bullshit jobs and what we can do about them. In regard to the effects, I'd like to mention one because that comes up throughout the book a couple of times, and that is the idea that we would have to work less if we wouldn't spend so much time on useless work, on bullshit jobs. You might know the famous quote from the economist John Maynard Keynes, who said in 1930 that due to technological advancement, in 100 years we would probably only work 15-hour weeks and life would be quite comfortable. And pretty much since the Industrial Revolution, again and again, there has been great fear that technological advancement would take away all work from workers and that it would lead to mass unemployment. And Graeber says all of this was perfectly correct. This is exactly what happened. However, we don't notice the effects because all the work that is no longer necessary due to technological advancement was replaced by meaningless work, by bullshit jobs. Graeber also proposes a solution, and that is a universal basic income. Because if there would be a universal basic income, people wouldn't be forced to work in bullshit jobs. And since they are suffering from it, they probably wouldn't do it anymore, and bullshit jobs would quickly go extinct. Let's finally proceed to the critique. Now, as you probably noticed, Graeber makes no secret of his political stance. On one hand, I think this is a good idea because in a topic like this one, the political stance will shine through over time anyways, and I'd say it is more transparent to clearly put it up front and to clearly state it up front. However, the disadvantage is that people who are on the other end of the political spectrum, liberals, probably won't read the book or won't take it seriously because it is from the opposite direction. And we have a risk here. Because, as I described, Graeber heavily relied on all those accounts sent to him by people, by readers of his article, by people following him on social media and whatnot. And there we obviously have to expect that a lot of those people have a similar political stance. And this also becomes clear in some of the accounts he quotes. So this data he has collected is probably skewed. It probably has more people from certain political areas than from others. And this leads to the question, how well founded is the book? How substantiated are Graeber's theories? Now, first of all, Graeber's material is rather weak because all those accounts he has collected, even though he has thousands of them, it still is a collection of anecdotes. It is not a methodological scientific study. And also the polls, the surveys he relies on are also not scientific studies, but mere polls, mere surveys. There actually was a scientific study in 2021 in the UK by Magdalena Sophia, Alex J. Wood and Brendan Burchell, where they tried to test Graeber's hypotheses in a proper scientific study. They didn't do own research, I have to admit though, but they used a big long-running study, the European Working Conditions Survey. And this survey includes a question, a statement, I have the feeling of doing useful work, that is rated by people on a scale from always to never in 5 steps. And the authors took all those people who marked rarely or never, because they expect those to be in the group that Graeber describes as having bullshit jobs. Now, the first surprise was that this group was way smaller than expected, because it was only about 5% of all participants, and in Graeber's surveys, in the polls Graeber used, it was about 40%. And furthermore, the number was decreasing instead of increasing. And another surprise was the distribution of people who say their work is useless among different jobs, because contrary to what Graeber expected, a lot of, for example, cleaners said their work had no purpose, was not useful, while very few people working in finance selected rarely or never. So the distribution among different areas, different types of jobs contradicted what Graeber expected. One thing that was confirmed in the study was the correlation between lack of purpose at work and lack of personal well-being. There really was a correlation, so this might be something that the study confirmed that to some extent. Correlation is no proof, but at least correlation was there. Now, the study is obviously methodologically cleaner than the material Graeber used, but still probably not perfect, because the phenomenon of bullshit jobs wasn't really the focus of the survey. And what I think might be a disadvantage is that in this survey, the questionnaires are filled out by an interviewer. So we have to ask how likely people are to admit that they believe their work has no meaning, no value. So there might be some issue there. Now, the big problem is obviously this subjective element we have. Now, Graeber said social value can't be measured, therefore we have to rely on the assessment of the employee himself. And Graeber believed that the employee himself is best qualified to judge whether his job is bullshit or not. However, the authors of that study, they have a different theory, because in the study they observed that a lot of those people who checked rarely or never for I'm doing useful work, they also describe in other parts of the study bad working conditions. So they have bad management, often have bad management, or a bad corporate culture, or very little freedom at work. So their theory is that bad working conditions lead to the belief, to the impression that one's work serves no purpose, that it doesn't actually depend on how much purpose the work has on an objective scale, if there was something like that. And this is something we might also expect, since we earlier discussed the book Feierabend by Volker Kietz, where Kietz said that nowadays we have such highly exaggerated expectations towards our work that even people who are, for example, bakers, who produce food where the social value is quite obvious, that even people like that say, oh, my work lacks purpose, my work lacks meaning, because our expectations are so exaggerated. My conclusion, after all, is I believe that bullshit jobs exist. However, I'd say we can't be sure about the scope at this point. Whether this really is a large social phenomenon, as Graeber believes and describes, or whether this is something that only occurs in rare and exceptional cases. I think to really figure that out, we would need a study that really focuses on the issue and that really differentiates between purpose and meaning for ourselves, for the company we work at, and for society as a whole. One aspect, one question that is missing in the book is, if I am stuck in a bullshit job, if I have a bullshit job, what should I do? How should I deal with this situation? What do I do if I can't easily find another job? This isn't discussed at all. Still, overall, I think this book is a nice new contribution to our topic of meaning at work. Up to now, we already had Volker Kietz, Feierabend, that I mentioned before, where Kietz says that nowadays we have over-exaggerated expectations towards our work, and that the idea that work should give meaning to our lives is unrealistic and exaggerated. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people like John Strzelecki who say that meaning is the ultimate goal, that our goal is to do what we really want, to figure out what that is and then to do it, and this is the path to true happiness. And I think one important addition Graeber makes here is the idea that lack of purpose at work might lead to a lack of social well-being, that this might have tangible negative effects. And I think we also benefit from the insight into the historical development of how our modern attitude towards work came to be. So overall, I'd say I'd recommend the book. I enjoyed it. I especially liked those parts about the historical development of our attitude toward work. By the way, do you know what is certainly not a bullshit task? Clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. This has clear value, at least for me, and I am quite happy about it. We will see each other again next week. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.